Good evening, and welcome back to my ASMR channel. Tonight, I wanted to go ahead and kick off a new series. I know that in the past, and probably in the present, and probably in the future, I have been better at kicking off new series that I have been at maintaining them. I'm hoping to break that trend tonight, but who knows? I have been thinking a lot about the things that I've wanted to talk about on my channel. And just sort of ideas that I wish that I could get out in a more immediate, tangible way. And also faster. I often, as those of you who follow my channel know, I'll often have a video that's sort of tries to be, can be subversive in its message. I don't do this to try and trick people. In fact, on one very real level, it's completely subconscious on my part. On another level, as I noticed it happening, I certainly nurtured it and found it to be an interesting way to kind of do takes on fairly traditional ASMR topics. But those videos require, one, they require a lot of thought, and they require quite a bit of work. And I have more things that I want to talk about that I'm going to be able to find frameworks for as traditional or even non-traditional ASMR videos. So I'm bringing this series into the world, which I'm calling Harsh Truths Softly Spoken. And the intention is that it's going to be, with the exception of this little notebook where I will kind of jot down ideas that I have about what I want to say. But apart from that, I'm largely sort of extemporaneously recorded and filmed with just a theme. And, since it's harsh truths, the themes are going to be things like illness and war and old age and things like that. And I figured if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to start it, I might as well start it with the biggest harsh truth of all, in case I never do another one. And that harsh truth is, of course, death. So, if you are death phobic, or if you are triggered by death, or if you think talking about, even in what I hope is a positive, constructive way, but if you think that talking about death, even in those kinds of contexts, if you think that's going to trigger you or make it harder for you to sleep, then you probably want to stop right now and find another video. And in fact, this series, if I keep doing this series, may only appeal to a small subset of my viewers / listeners, and that's fine. I'm not always shooting. There are admittedly some videos where my goal is to reach as many people as possible. And those might be the videos where I would sort of subvertly put something else in there, kind of sugarcoat, put the pill in some hamburger meat. Not that I have medicine for people, or that I think that I have such an enlightened view of the world that I need to enlighten everybody else. They're just thoughts that I have that I want to get out. And I know if I just come out and say these things, a lot of times that can be off-putting. To wit, the sedition and sedation video I did on Trump, or the So I Heard an Idiot Kicked You Out of the Military video, or the binaural barber video to a lesser extent, or the Pursuing Your Dreams video. Anything where I bring up things directly that are uncomfortable. So there's a place for that stuff. There's a place for this stuff. But let's get to the reason that we're here. And that is to talk about death. So here's my notebook. I have a couple of really just 2 pages of sort of bullet point notes that I want to try and hit on. And I may not get all of them. I may not get to all of them. Before I start, though, I do want to say sort of one other thing. This is absolutely, first of all, I didn't do any formal research in preparation of this video, so I might be getting facts wrong. I might be misremembering things. It's been a long time since I've been in a philosophy class. It's actually been it hasn't been a very long time, but it's been a fair amount of time since I've read a philosophy text or reread a philosophy text. So obviously when you're talking about death, philosophical issues are going to creep in. But I didn't want to, what I didn't want to do with this series is I didn't want to say, okay, well, I'm going to talk about death. Let me Google death and let me look up the questions people have about death and let me do that. I didn't want to do that because, just like all of you have your own views on death and life and myriad other things, I have my own view, and I didn't want it to be colored by the sort of vox populi notions that I would get, and they would inherently, I wouldn't be able to avoid having them color what I talk about or the way that I talk about it. So I purposely didn't do that. The only thing I did, I don't know if I'm going to get to it here, but I did look up the name of the Cyclops. Well, there's a Cyclops who, when we get to it, I looked at the name of the Cyclops, which I couldn't find his name. So that was the only thing that I looked up when formulating these notes. Apart from that, it was just me sort of sitting on a couch, staring at the wall opposite my couch with a pen and with some, light music on in the background as I just jotted stuff down as it came into my head. And then I tried, you can see like the arrows and all this, the numbers and all that. After jotting all this stuff down, I tried to give it some sense of order without rewriting it. So that's my process, and my disclaimer is that, on one hand, I want to say I'm no expert. And yet on the other hand, I want to be what might be perceived as arrogant and say nobody's an expert. So we're all alive, we're all facing the same event at the end of our lives. None of us know what's going to happen or how it's going to manifest. So in a very real sense, I mean, there are people who spend their lives thinking about this kind of stuff, and it could be argued, and it is arguable that they have more to say, but they also might have less in common with people who maybe don't think about it as much or try not to think about it as much. And one of the key things here is I don't think that's bad, and a lot of people don't think that there's anything wrong with choosing to not dwell on death. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I just wanted to say that, you're not going to come out of this video any wiser, I don't think, than you were coming into it. However, if I'm predicting the length of this video to be around an hour, because most of my videos end up being around an hour, even though I don't really shoot for them to be that long. But if this video ends up being about an hour long, more than 6,000 people on Earth will have died during the time that it took for that video to be complete. There's your first harsh truth. And I did Google that, actually, so that was another thing I Googled, and I wasn't planning on saying this, it reminded me that it's not really related, but the birth rate is double that. So don't worry, even though 6,000 and some odd of us are dying every hour, there are 2 babies taking the place of the 2 for everyone. It's a sale. 2 humans, 2 brand new baby humans for every old, decrepit, or tragically deceased human that you turn in. All right. So, death. First of all, it sucks. It's a crappy thing. So, when we think about the realities of death, there are things that we just don't know. We don't know when we're going to die. And I'm broad stroking this here. Obviously, some of us might have a better idea of when we're going to die than others. We don't know, and this is sort of chief among my points tonight, is we don't know what the process of death is like. Like, we don't know what actually happens when you die, what it feels like, what the final synapse firings are like, what cellular decay feels like to a conscious being. We have some, reports and approximations and people who have had near-death experiences, but near-death experience is not death. So, and I realize there are people who have died and been brought back to life after a few minutes. I don't know. I'm skeptical of those reports for a number of reasons that I don't want to spend too much time getting into here. But I think it's safe to say that we don't know what the process is like. You don't know what to expect, and somebody can tell you what to expect or try and explain to you scientifically what's going to happen and how that might be interpreted by extrapolating when similar processes happen in different scenarios or in near-death scenarios, and try and extrapolate then what that would mean for, let's say, full death, right? But these are incomplete, and I would almost say irrelevant reports, because death is one thing. It's one thing, right? It is not all the things that happen before it. And what happens after it is largely immaterial when we're talking about the process of dying. So we don't know what the process is like. We don't know what comes after. Obviously, there are people who believe that there's a lot that comes after. There are people who believe that nothing comes after, and there are people who think that it's beyond our capacity to even imagine what comes after, but that it is wrong to say nothing comes after, or an afterlife, or to sort of quantify an afterlife in any way, because we don't have the context to be able to do so. So we don't know what comes after. We don't generally know how we're going to die. Some people do. Some people think they know how they're going to die and end up dying some other way. But as a broad sort of stroke again, we don't know how we're going to die. And this is also key. So not knowing what the process is like, I'd like you to kind of hold that idea in your head. And then also not knowing what your egos and what your reaction is going to be, like what your conscious concept of yourself, like what is your reaction going to be? I'm not talking about necessarily, and well, maybe I am talking about the process leading up to death, but I'm including dying itself, because it is possible that once your body and mind are actually in the process of dying, that is, there's nothing else that your body can try and get you to do to save your own life. There is no more fight or flight response. You're beyond that point. It is possible, and it's certainly reassuring to think that at that point, there is some sense of calm. And a lot of philosophers do kind of talk about this idea that in the last moment, however they manifest it or talk about it, and religious leaders too, talk about this sort of moment of clarity, this sort of last, whether it be a flashback of your entire life. What I shouldn't have laughed at that. It's very possible that all your synapses might go crazy, although I think there have been EEGs taken of dying people, and that doesn't seem to be exactly what's happening. But again, we don't know. But what is your reaction going to be at the moment of death? We don't know. Don't know. You can think about it your entire life. You can spend your entire life thinking about it and trying to prepare yourself for what is essentially unpreparable. You can do that, or you can choose to spend your time doing something else, which I highly recommend. And part of that sort of idea of what is your reaction going to be is, are you a foxhole atheist? Are you going to convert at the last moment? Are you going to, and I suppose, honestly, at that point, you are learning the truth, whether you sort of, and the thing is that everything that I'm saying here, I'm speaking in the context of being alive and having the ontogeny that is you and all the events of your life and the way that things filter through you, which, again, death is very far removed from that. So I find myself falling into this trap as I talk about it, which is interesting and also, I think, unavoidable. But bottom line, we don't know what our reaction is going to be like. So what do we know? Like, what do we know about death? We know it happens to everybody. Everybody. There's headline from the satirical online newspaper, The Onion, that I remember from, it must have been a dozen years ago or more, that read something like, "World death rate still holding at 100%, in spite of doctors' best efforts." I mean, everybody, this is obvious, don't need to to hammer this point too much, but we're all going to die. And statistically speaking, from looking at my subscriber demographics, all die before you do. And perhaps that's comforting, perhaps it's not. I don't really find it comforting or discomforting, but so anyway, it happens to everybody. Nobody escapes. It's often, although not always, preceded by illness. And this is also something that's very frightening for people, is you don't want to experience the pain. You don't want to put your loved ones through the experience of you being in pain, of feeling bad for you, that empathy. And perhaps you don't want to be remembered the way that you were at the end of your life. You want to be remembered the way you were when you were more vital. It's perfectly valid, perfectly reasonable want to have. We know it's devastating to those who love you. And it is, and there's sort of, that's one part of this that I wonder, and lots of people wonder, is that something that can be changed? Because that has to do with the cult of death and the ideas and the fear and the avoidance of talking about and embracing death as much as we can. The fact that we are trapped in experiencing time in a linear fashion means that obviously once somebody dies, you're never going to be able to see them again, as far as you know. It's very hard to just live in memories or to be comforted, really, by memories, because a lot of what memories do is make you yearn to be with that person, especially if they're good memories. You want to make more of them, right? So, yeah, death is devastating to those that love you, and it has certainly been recorded that there are people who have shunned their loved ones in the months or even years prior to their death, specifically for the purpose of sparing them some of that heartache, which is wrong, I think, unequivocally. But it is also an understandable reaction. You're trying to protect the ones you love. So it's devastating to those who love you. Every moment of your life, you're closer to death than you were the moment before. By the time I'm done recording this video, I will be 1 hour closer to my death, and if you watched it or listened to the entire thing, you'll be about an hour closer to your death, and you'll never get that time back. It is coming. It is imminent. When I say imminent, I mean on a universal scale, not necessarily on sort of our scale of time. Although I don't know the situation of anybody who's watching this, so it's possible that it's more imminent for some than others. So every moment it comes closer. And there are things you can do to stave it off. There are things you can do to prolong your life. You could eat healthy your entire life and exercise your entire life, get hit by a car. Again, I don't think this is a valid argument for not eating healthy or exercising. I'm just saying there's an element of stochastic, there's a randomness to it as well. And so finally, what I have on my little list here for what we do know is it's by design. Now, whether you believe in God or you're an atheist or an agnostic or whatever your belief system is, death is by design. And I don't mean intelligent design, although if you believe in God, you obviously believe it's intelligent design. But without death, there would be no evolution. We would not be able to evolve. We would not be able to mingle our genes and pass down a hopefully more robust specimen via procreation. It just wouldn't happen. It would throw the balance of everything off. The earth could not support immortal beings, billions and billions of immortal beings. It just wouldn't work. So I think some of those things, being preceded by illness and being devastated to those who love you, and every moment it comes a little bit closer, those things are inherently frightening. But I also think that there's some inherent solace in the fact that it happens to everybody and the fact that it is by design. Now, how much comfort you take in those things that's your mileage may vary in so many ways. But I do think that there is some amount of succor to be had, knowing that everybody is going to die, and everyone who has died. I mean, if you think about the billions of people who have died, they've all gone first, if you want to think of it that way. So perhaps that is reassuring in some way. Personally, I find it more reassuring that it is by design, although also personally, I don't find either of those things that reassuring. So why is it so frightening? And the notes I have here for that are interesting. So as conscious beings, life is the entirety of our experience. We have no experience of death. We only have experience of life. So when we start to think about death, we are entering an area that we just can't conceive of it. We can't realistically get a good concept of it or get a framework around it, because it is utterly outside of our experience as beings that have only ever existed alive, right? Before you were born, you weren't thinking about what it was going to be like when you were alive. And, maybe this is not true, but my strong suspicion is when you die, you'll also not be thinking too much about that. So it has all these sort of concepts related to it that we just can't conceive. And a good allegory for this that I'm sure, I stole from somebody, although I don't know who, and I feel like it's just something I came up with one day, is that if you right now um, try to think of an alien, just think of an alien. Try to make it the most alien you can, right? Um, Try not to tie it back to anything within your within your mental ontology. Try not to tie it back to anything that exists in the world, the universe. It's impossible. It's not. It cannot be done. Like, it cannot be conceived. We cannot conceive of things outside the set of things that we were given to conceive with. All we can do is make connections. What you end up with is a hodgepodge, a thing that is half elephant, half fungus, half planetary body. Maybe if you're thinking big, if you're thinking of maybe, like, even if you're going that far and you're thinking of life as extraterrestrial life, if it exists, something we would not recognize as life. A galaxy may be a form of life, right? I mean, but even if you're thinking like that, you're still thinking of things that exist in the world. And if you're thinking of a creature with an elephant's trunk and the arms of a squid and the feet of a platypus and whatever it is that you're, you know, even if you're not thinking of it in terms of those animals, if you were to draw what you were thinking of, you would be able to say, oh, look, these hands are like the hands of this. Or, oh, these feet look like these rock formations that I saw once. You cannot conceive of, it's like we were given Legos to play with, and those are our thoughts. And we can only build things out of Legos. We can't suddenly build things out of clay, because we don't have clay. we have no experience of clay. We don't possess any clay. We can make something, and we can think about the abstract idea of clay, but we can't create a thought out of anything but Lego, and therefore all of our thoughts are Lego based. And yes, this video is sponsored by Lego. Thank you. That's exactly what Lego want. They wanted to sponsor a video where I babble about death for an hour. Where am I now? So we're thinking about things that we just can't conceive, and that's scary. That's frightening. It is the ultimate in unknowableness. We don't want to hurt our loved ones. We don't want to abandon our loved ones. We don't want them to, if we have lived fairly normal lives, if we have lived, normal is not the right word, if we have lived natural lives, we will generally see our parents die. Progeny sees their parents die. Parents don't see their progeny die, except in these sort of tragic exceptions. But we know what that feels like. We know that pain, and we don't want to confer that pain onto our loved ones, whether they be our children or even our friends, or our parents, right? So that's really frightening, and worrying about that consumes a lot of people. When they think about death, that's largely what they're worried about. They're less worried about what's going to happen to them, what their experience is going to be, and they're more worried about what's going to happen to the people around them. And that's one of the reasons I wanted you to keep that thought in your head of sort of why that is an area of fearing death that can be changed via societal change about the way we think about death. Because if we knew that our loved ones were taken care of and would not mourn our passing, not to say they don't love us, but they're thinking about life and death in a different, from a totally different point of view, one that doesn't require mourning. If that were the case, I believe some of the burden would be lifted. And these ideas are not, obviously, lots of people have had these ideas. There's a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician. I'll put a link below. I was just recently made aware of it, and she talks about some of these concepts as well. And she founded something. I think she founded it. No, actually, I'm not sure who founded it, but it's called the Order of the Good Death. It's a very interesting sort of. First of all, it's interesting. I'll put the link. Take a look at it yourselves if you like, if you're interested. But it's fascinating because there are things about death that we can't change, but there are things about death and our fears about death that we can change. We just have to want to change them. So we don't want to hurt any of our loved ones. And sort of, as I mentioned before, our egos have no concept and cannot process the idea of not being alive, because we've been alive since the day we were born. So I sort of covered this before I got to the point, but that sums up the point I was talking about before. Is it's just we don't have the tools necessary to objectively assess the impact of our own death, or imagine our own death in the way we might imagine other scenarios that are terrestrial. And by terrestrial, I don't necessarily just mean on Earth, but things that we experience without interrupting the flow of our ontology. And then we're able to reflect on them, and then other people can reflect on them, and we can learn from the people who were able to experience these things and reflect on them and teach to us. We don't have any such teachers, unless you include religious leaders, which I don't. So I think those cover, at least, like I said, this was not super formal, but that I think covers, in my mind anyway, what about death is so frightening. So the next question, the question that immediately follows is, okay, so here are the things that we know, here are the things we don't know, here are the things that make it so frightening. So what do we do? What are the steps that we can take to alleviate some of that fear and not have it be something that we carry with us and obsess about or think about more than we should? Well, okay, so the first and the most popular way that is done is via religion. So I'm personally, I'm not going to get in this. I don't want this to turn to a lecture of any sort. I'm an atheist personally. I don't. I have no qualms with religion except for when they oppress kill, except when they're used as a tool um, to hurt other people, including people within their own religion. And there are religions that are very self-oppressive as well. Obviously, I don't need to go into that too much. But I mean, almost every religion I can think of, certainly Christianity as a whole, um, there's that they were birthed by death. They were birthed by our knowledge and fear of death. They were birthed by wanting to be able to have somebody who could relay the experience to us and pat us on the backs and say, it's going to be okay. And then, of course, when you have one small group of select people who are sort of the holders of those rules, then you engender that kind of cloistered mentality that is, you immediately jump from there to, well, if you follow these rules, you're going to be okay. And if you don't follow these rules, you won't. That's my major, problem. That's where the oppression comes in, and that's where the persecution comes in. And that's where religion really makes me want to puke. I'm trying to be objective. Organized religion, I'm just not a fan of organized religion. And I don't believe that there is any sort of mystical melding of minds into one giant universal body at the end of our lives. I don't believe that there is any sort of an afterlife, because our Legos are taken away, right? So we were given Legos at the start of our life. Legos are all we know, and the Legos are gone at the end of our lives. There are other things, but they are not Legos. And in my opinion, it is fruitless to ponder those things too much, because we can only ponder them with Legos. But yeah, I mean, religion uses death and the possibility of being reunited with your loved ones as a method of enforcement, which don't like. And religion is a human construct. It's something that somebody once said, "Hey, I have an idea. There's a creature that lives in the sky that said, do this thing and you'll get everlasting life." That thing that happened to your grandfather, that your grandfather stopped moving and then decayed and then wasn't there anymore, that you're afraid of happening to you because you know it happens to everybody else. Well, I know somebody who knows what actually is going on there, and that person tells me that you should do this and that if you want to avoid the horrible fate that your grandfather endured. And yet, even though that sounded bitter and sarcastic, and I genuinely apologize for that, I completely understand why one would want to believe in the afterlife and why one would want to believe in religion. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so skeptical about it, is because my natural intention is to want to believe. It's like the X-Files. I want to believe. Doesn't help me in any way for there to not be an afterlife. I would much prefer the thought of eternal life, even though that is a thought based on fear, because it just means I don't want things to change so much that I no longer recognize them and that I no longer can conceive what they are. I want there to be this, oh, the afterlife. Yeah, it's kind of like regular life, except it's in the clouds and you have wings. Honestly, you know, I have the same reaction as I do to when people say they saw aliens that look basically human, but they have 3 fingers instead of 5, and they have big eyes and big heads. It's like, come on, come up with something a little more, a little more off the beaten path than that. I guess, with aliens, there's the argument that, oh, but these are the aliens that were our progenitors and they seeded the earth, whatever. I don't know that a lot of these people were thinking that far ahead when they came up with, I'm off track. We're not talking about aliens. This is not, maybe that's a harsh truth. Aliens could be one. Right, so staving off the fear. Religion, belief in the afterlife. Another thing that we do is we have children. It's a biological imperative. We have kids. We feel that we achieve some small amount of immortality through our children, who theoretically continue to pass down our genetic material, although many of them will just be dead ends and we won't know about it because we'll have been dead. But that is, one way how we sort of ameliorate a bit of that, the fear of ceasing to exist is continued existence through our offspring. And another thing we do, and spend a lot of time doing this, and a lot of this I've actually gone over already. I sort of got ahead of myself quite a bit here, but we try and abstract death away. We try and deconstruct it into a set of things that we can understand, and that we can sort of one by one, sort of point by point, go over and say, well, this one's, you take this away and it's not so bad. It's almost, we're trying to define life as this checklist of things that we can then sort of point to and go through and say, well, examples or memory and experiences, right? Those are one aspect, a sort of an ongoing moment-to-moment culmination of memory and experience, right? That's one of the hallmarks of what makes an individual a living person. But you can lose your memory, and there are creatures that have very little memory at all, and they're still defined as alive. So we'd be like, well, that is one of the hallmarks of life, and yet if we lose that, we don't really lose everything. You're still alive. Your physical structures, the whole thing about your skin gets replaced completely 7 times, and every cell in your body is replaced 7 times during your life, with the exception of your brain cells, which of course are, that's very significant, but it's not even the cells themselves that are important. It is the structure of the cells and how they have grown and the patterns that they are in that are especially important. Your way of looking at the world, that's another thing that sort of constitutes an individual, is not only having the experiences and the memories, but then how that informs what you do, how you react in any given situation, the type of person that you are. And these are things that consistent over time, over your ontogeny, that sort of make you a living individual. So we try and define life as this sort of set of parameters that we deconstruct because people lose their memory. Um, Points of view change all the time. And by doing that, we feel like we can remove, we can steal a little bit of death's power. Because maybe if these things were to happen to us one by one, I lose an arm, it's a whole arm, but I'm still alive, I'm still me. So it's that philosophical question of what is the line of what is me? And if we can't define what that is, then why does death hold such existential power over us? And I think the answer to that question is that we inherently know the truth, right? Nobody, and perhaps this is me and the time, or us as a function of the time that we're living in, but I don't think anybody ever really thought when they broke a fingernail fell off their body, that they were any less themselves than they were when they had the fingernail, or when they lose a tooth, or there are things that people know to be inherently true because you just feel it. Personally, like I have a really hard time imagining, and I can't divorce myself from where I am. I have a really hard time imagining living in the era where they thought the soul and the thinking occurred in the heart or the chest. For me, and again, I don't know if it's because it's where my eyes are or it's just what I've been told. For me, I feel the thinking going on in my head. And part of me is just like, how could anyone not have thought, how could anyone have been tricked into thinking that they were thinking in their heart when I can feel myself thinking in my head? But then, of course, I think, well, can I feel myself thinking in my head? Or is that a function of the fact that that's where my eyes and my mouth are, and therefore, like a periscope on a submarine is where the eye could be down in the submarine. Maybe the thinking part is, this is just my periscope, and the thinking is actually happening down here. So maybe that's what it was, but I have trouble thinking about that a lot. I have trouble thinking about it and seeing how anyone would have not seen through it. But that's me. And I do think that there is a level of when we tell ourselves these constructs, we want them to work. And so there's a bit of a placebo effect going on there, even though we see through them. So even though we might doubt them, we still see through them. So even sort of the one that I find the most convincing when it comes to when it comes to trying to reconcile my own life with infinity, is that I wasn't alive prior to the 1970s. I was not alive for billions of years prior to that. And right now I am alive, and sometime universally speaking, the blink of an eye, I won't be alive anymore. And then billions of years will pass where I'm not alive, and I was alive in this, sort of minuscule window. And yet I don't mourn the years that I was not alive prior to being born. I'm only mourning the time after I'm alive, after I've already come into being, after I've already become enlightened, if you will. Like I've seen, I've tasted the Pierian spring, so to speak, and now I don't want to let go of it. But to me, that also speaks to another point, which I'll get to in a minute. I'll hold that thought. Um, so, right. So we know these experiences, we know these things that seem false, or that we want to feel true, but that seem false because our experience is so limited by linear time. Like that is the difference there. Like I cannot look at my life as hopefully 80 years of this window of 80 years that I was alive. I cannot look at that in a non-linear way because I'm traveling through it in one direction with one inevitable conclusion. And I don't see it as this chunk of time amidst the vastness of time before and after that just was. I see it as the ultimate sort of egotistical trip, in that it feels to me as if the universe was created when I was born and will disappear when I die. I don't mean that literally. I mean that is sort of the way that it feels. So, what can we do about this? We've talked about, what have we talked about? We've talked about what we don't know. We've talked about what we do know. We've talked about why it's frightening. We've talked about how we try and stave off the fear, and that those methods fall short in large part because we inherently have some knowledge of the truth. And the answer is I don't know, right? Obviously, if you were hoping for an answer at the end of this video, you're going to leave disappointed. And you can hit the dislike button, but please don't hit the dislike button. I know there's a bunch of you that are going to hit it no matter what. Other people got you covered. You don't have to hit the dislike button. Someone else is going to do it for you. Don't worry about it. You have a very limited amount of time left to live, so don't waste it hitting the dislike button. Do waste it hitting the like button. But what can we do? I don't know what we can do. But one of the things we might do, and this was one of the things that I asked you to hold in your head much earlier in the video, is maybe we don't think about it. Maybe we choose not to think about it. And maybe that is the way to live the best life. The Cyclops that gave up its eye in order to see the future was cursed, in that the only future that it was able to see was the date of its own death. We practically all see the date of our own deaths. We may not know the day, but to what degree of granularity would you need to know for it to be a curse to you? If you knew the day but not the minute, would that be vague enough to reassure you? If you knew the month but not the day, if you knew the year but not the month, if you knew the decade, like at what point is it like, okay, that's all right then? And the answer is it's a function of the span of our lives. We live for 70, 80 years. So of course we're going to say that's the window of uncertainty that I want. But 70 to 80 years is nothing in the larger sort of scheme of things. So, I mean, we don't know what second we're going to die, but we have a pretty good idea of when we're going to die. So we're all sort of walking around with that curse. It's just not that precise. So maybe we don't think about it. There are definite benefits to that point of view. There are definite benefits to not thinking about it. And there are philosophical arguments for not letting fear of death get in the way of decisions you make in life. Socrates argued that he argued that since it's impossible to know what happens when you die, um, that it is folly to use that when weighed against anything that you do know that's wrong. So if someone were to say to you, betray your friends or I'm going to kill you, Socrates' argument was you should always take the allow yourself to be killed option, because if you don't, you are assuming that you know that dying is going to be worse than, or I'm sorry, is going to be worse than betraying your friends, and you don't know that. You just don't. But you do know. So you have dying over here, and you don't know what that means. You do have betrayal, and you know that betrayal is wrong and bad, and is an injustice. So you would have to choose, well, I'm going to die instead, because you're, again, weighing something you don't know you don't know if it's bad or good against something that you do know is bad. And so it's morally incumbent upon you to choose the thing that you don't know if it's bad or not. And if you act like you know it's bad, that's false wisdom, because nobody can know that. So that was one of the arguments Socrates used. Apparently, I don't think this was actually from, I think it was from Plato, obviously. But there's something about this logic that doesn't sit well with me, and it's specifically that the unknown is inherently scary. The unknown is scary. I don't have to know that death is better or worse to be scared, to not want to go there, because I don't know it, and therefore I am afraid of it. Whereas betraying my friends, sorry friends, betraying my friends, I do know it's bad, but I also know how bad it is, and I can quantify how bad it is, whereas I have no ability to quantify anything about death. And I love life. So I don't want it to change, and I don't believe in an afterlife. So maybe that's what he was talking about when he was saying it's folly to assume knowledge of what happens after you die, and that includes not believing in an afterlife just as much as it includes believing in an afterlife. Maybe that's what he meant. I don't know. He was a different era. They wore weird clothes back then and stuff. But so maybe we don't think about it. If there's nothing we can do about it, or there are certain things we can do about it, we go ahead and do those things, but we don't waste any more time beyond that thinking about it. That might be the key to how to live the least encumbered life, given the fact that, unfortunately, we all do know pretty much in the grand scheme of things, the date of our death. We can control how we live, and we should sort of feel extra empowered by that, and use the deadline, as it were, to empower us to do things. This is a horribly trivial thing, but I wanted to make YouTube videos for a long time, but I was afraid, because I didn't want to be ridiculed. I didn't want people to see it. If anyone ever would see it and get embarrassed by it. There were all these reasons why I didn't want to do it, but they were all based on this fear that as I got older, that fear just went away. Because I was like, well, I'm also getting old. I'm going to die if I'm going to do it. What the hell? Might as well do it. And then we can sort of try and amalgamate all the avenues of solace that we can. So, billions of people have died before me. Okay, I'm not significant. I'm just another one in that line. If you can take any solace in someone else going first, we have a wealth of that. As mentioned earlier, death is by design. It is not an aberration. It is how we are designed. It is part of the life cycle. It's part of, there are analogies within nature. There are analogies for death with all ecosystems and all living things and even non-living things. I mean, just the existence of time and entropy, all these things point towards the idea of death being a natural phenomenon that is supposed to happen. And perhaps you can take some solace in knowing or feeling that. So I've written down here something that I don't know. So what I've written down is, I will become part of the universe in a way that I cannot possibly yet understand. Because I can't possibly understand it, it's hard for me to take solace in it. And it is a big unknown. But certainly it's a possibility. Certainly my constituent matter and my cells will be absorbed into the soil and be worm food and then become a feather on a bird or whatever ends up happening there. Parts of me will be inhaled by other humans. There's all kinds of things. You don't know where your atoms are going to end up. But again, your atoms don't matter so much as the arrangement of your atoms and molecules. And so I have that written down here. I'm not so sure. Not so sure how much it helps me. But the fact that I can acknowledge that I'm consumed by my own ego, and therefore I can't objectively think about death as anything else other than a negative, at least that makes me think in a way that I am imagining the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is this wonderful thing that I am and that we all are will no longer exist. And that is almost certainly a complete misunderstanding of things. It is a completely egocentric way of looking at things. So if you can try and look at things less selfishly and less through the lens of yourself, it might be easier to come to grips with the reality of your imminent dispersal. Of course, there's always the possibility of an afterlife of some sort. And if you believe in that sort of thing, that's really all you need. And who am I to tell you I don't have any more knowledge than you do. So you could be right. I could be right. When I say I'm an atheist, that means that I believe there is no afterlife. I don't claim to know it. I just believe it. Just like I could be convinced otherwise, it would be difficult to convince me, but I certainly think I could be convinced. There would have to be a lot of evidence, but maybe I could get there. Another one I have down here, which now again I'm looking back on it, but I don't believe it is. We will be able to rest, and that is totally a human construct, and I should cross it out because the idea of needing to rest doesn't mean anything unless you're alive and have need of rest. So I don't really buy that, that this person is at rest. Yes, if somebody was suffering, if somebody was actively suffering and their suffering stopped, that is a good thing. If there was no other way for their suffering to stop, then that is a good thing. But the word rest implies some kind of ongoing, it's short for restorative, right? and that's not happening. So I don't really think that's great. So I think if these are things that can sort of get us to the finish line with a minimal amount of suffering, that's probably the most that we can ask for. And if I can go back for a moment to sort of talk about the ashes to ashes idea of the gulfs of time that exist on either end of our ontology, before we were born and after we die, these huge gulfs of time and this tiny little window where we're alive. If we truly do not mourn the time before we were born, then we also really do not mourn the time after we're already gone, after our death is over. We don't mourn that. In that case, what we're really mourning is that period of time, however long, the actual process of death. And I don't know how long it takes to die, but it's a very small window, right? Even if you have a degenerative disease, and admittedly some of these can drag on significantly, but hopefully for most of you and for most of us, our window of time where we will be directly experiencing the process of death is small. And with that being the case, we really shouldn't let, if we have an 80-year lifespan, we shouldn't let 5 minutes or an hour or even 2 weeks, we shouldn't let the rest of our time be spoiled by that small sort of window of the process of dying, even though it is very, very frightening and it's something that we know we're going to have to endure. I also think we shouldn't be concerned with how we behave during that time. Nobody knows what's going to happen then. So all sort of thoughts of propriety or dignity or whatever, everything is forgiven in there. There's no wrong that can happen there. So yeah, I mean those are the points of solace. I mean, it doesn't erase anything that you've done, dying, and for some people that might be a bad thing, but for most of us that is something that we should take comfort in, is that we cannot judge the effect of our lives on the world or on the universe. We don't know who we've touched, what change we've affected, whether we knew it or not, whether it's through bringing a new life into a world, whether it's by just being nice to people every day, right? Whatever it is that we do, I mean, even inadvertently, we can cause harm and we can cause good. We should try and, it's a cliche, but we should try and leave the world a better place than it was when we entered it. We should, just like you try and zero out your carbon footprint, we should sort of leave with the balance books in the black, because your effect on the world just cannot be measured. And finally, I'm going to leave you all with this. It only happens once. You're only going to have to go through it one time. I know that saying, that line from Shakespeare, I think, and I don't know which play it's from, but a coward dies many times before their death, a hero only once, or the valiant only once, I think something like that. But that that saying always had the opposite effect on me, which I was always like, "Ooh, well, I want to I want to be able to die many times." That sounds like I'm a check coward in that box. But comedy aside, we die once. We live many, many, many days, many, many years, hopefully many, many decades, and we only die once. Um, so, I mean, my recommendation is uh, think about something else that was, it's strange, like existentialism is thought of as one of the schools of philosophy that is very morbid, but Nietzsche was very of the same opinion. He thought it was a waste of time to think about death. Um, Freud had other Freud had other thoughts on the subject, but um, to the best of your ability, I think the thing to do is just not to dwell on it, and to take solace in the stuff that we've talked about, if you can. Um, and know statistically that I'm likely to die before you, so I'll be in that line of billions that has gone on before you. And if that helps you at all, take it. All right. Hopefully that wasn't too tough. I hope I didn't sound preachy. Certainly didn't mean to. And hopefully this series will continue. I'm going to use this notebook probably specifically just for this series, because I think it'll help me. I get a running start at something, and I see stuff start to be accomplished. And once I have something going, it makes it much easier for me to continue. I have that sort of beginner's inertia that is hard to overcome. But once I overcome it, I tend to do all right. So we'll see. All right. Take care, everybody, and I will see you all again soon. And until then, don't die.